It was Christmas morning, and the world outside my window glittered under a thin sheet of frost. The air was sharp enough to bite through my sweater as I stood in the living room, clutching a cup of coffee that had long gone cold in my hands. My name is Emily Carter, and this is what happened. The house smelled of cinnamon and burnt toast, but there was a stillness hanging in the air, heavy, expectant. I thought it was the kind of quiet you get before a surprise, before laughter erupts and someone pulls a ribboned box from behind their back. I thought wrong. My father stood by the tree, arms crossed, mouth set in a grim line. His eyes, always a cool blue, now felt as sharp and cold as the ice slicking the driveway outside. Beside him, my mother sat on the arm of the couch, hands folded, tightly in her lap, gaze fixed somewhere beyond the Christmas lights. "Emily," my father said, voice low, steady, merciless. "It's time you left." I blinked, certain I'd misheard him. The clock above the mantel ticked loudly, each second stretching longer than the last. A half-wrapped present lay abandoned on the coffee table. My breath caught in my throat as the silence settled into my bones. "What?" The word barely made it past my lips. "You heard me," he said. "You're an adult. It's time to move on. Pack your things." I looked at my mother, searching her face for some sign. Confusion. Objection, anything. But she wouldn't meet my eyes. She just pressed her lips tighter together and shifted slightly, as if the conversation was an uncomfortable commercial she wished would end. At the doorway, a suitcase stood upright. It was mine, my worn red duffel, the same one I had used for overnight school trips when I was 16. They had packed it for me, folded my life into a zippered bag without a word. I wanted to scream, to demand answers. But something deeper held me still. A cold, creeping understanding that the decision had been made long before today. I set my coffee down, the porcelain clinking sharply against the table. In the silence that followed, I felt the severing, a slow, invisible tear between myself and everything I had believed about home, about family, about belonging. The Christmas tree twinkled mockingly behind them, casting flickering shadows on the walls. In the corner of the room, a framed family photo, our smiles captured forever, caught the light and gleamed like a shard of broken glass. Without another word, I picked up the suitcase. The zipper snagged slightly as I pulled it, a small, mean sound in the heavy quiet. Outside, the cold slapped my cheeks, turning my tears instantly sharp and burning. Behind me, the door clicked shut, cutting me off from the only life I had ever known. Merry Christmas, Emily. Growing up, our house always felt heavy, like the walls carried secrets they wouldn't share. It wasn't that my parents were cruel. No, cruelty would have been easier to understand. It was the silence that did the damage, the way approval was given like breadcrumbs scattered across a cold kitchen floor. You could spend your whole life chasing it, hoping for a full meal that never came. I learned early that love had conditions. Good grades bought smiles. Chores done without asking earned a nod. But needing something in return, affection, praise, time, was a sign of weakness. Strength in my family was measured by how little you asked for. When I turned 17, the acceptance letter came from a university 3 states away. I remember holding the envelope in my hands, feeling the possibility of a life that didn't revolve around muted glances and unspoken expectations. I had imagined the moment, the celebration, the pride in my parents' eyes, but it never came. Instead, that spring, my mother fell ill. A diagnosis whispered behind a closed doctor's office door, the kind that rearranges your whole life in a single afternoon. Plans shifted like sand. The college brochures ended up in a shoebox under my bed, buried beneath sweaters I no longer wore. Someone had to stay. Someone had to make dinner, drive to appointments, pay the bills when the hospital visits started, stacking up. And so, without a formal conversation, it became me. Emily, the good daughter. Emily, who never asked why. At first, it felt like love, like devotion, like something noble and strong. I told myself I was doing what family was supposed to do. I wore that narrative like armor, even as the edges cut deeper over time. Years passed, and the house that once held my childhood dreams hardened into something else, a place of routines and obligations, endless cycles of giving with little left for myself. I stopped noticing the pictures on the walls. I stopped lighting candles at the dinner table. I stopped asking for anything at all. My mother's health stabilized eventually, but by then, the pattern was set. I wasn't a daughter anymore. I was staff, invisible unless needed, valuable only when useful. I stayed. Through every holiday, every late-night trip to the pharmacy, every insurance battle. I stayed when friends moved out, when they posted pictures from dorm rooms and crowded city apartments. I stayed even when resentment whispered at the edges of my heart, reminding me I had traded my future for a loyalty no one seemed to value. It was a quiet sort of sacrifice, the kind that doesn't get thanked, the kind that looks invisible, to anyone not living inside it. I thought, maybe, they would see me. Maybe one day they would remember everything I had given up. But standing there on Christmas morning, suitcase by the door, I realized they had seen me all along. They just didn't care. There's a sound ice makes when it's ready to break, a deep, aching groan beneath the surface. Looking back, I realize our house had been making that sound for a long time. I just didn't want to hear it. It started small. My father took a new job across town, one that paid better but seemed to hollow him out a little more each day. He came home later, ate dinner in silence, and spent his evenings locked away in the study, the glow of his computer screen leaking under the door like a thin, cold mist. He spoke less, smiled less, laughed not at all. My mother changed too. At first, I thought it was just exhaustion. She had always been delicate since her illness, moving carefully, like the world might bruise her. But it wasn't her body that grew colder. It was something deeper, something in the way she would leave the room when I entered, how her hand would stiffen if mine brushed hers by accident. I'd hear them sometimes, whispering behind closed doors. Quick, hushed conversations that cut off the moment I got too close. Once I caught my name, just a sharp syllable, hurriedly swallowed, and something tight and unspoken curled up in my chest. The spaces between us grew wider, stretched, by things none of us would name. Dinner became a quiet ritual of clinking forks and a television humming in the background. Birthdays came and went with obligatory cards and hastily bought gifts. The warmth that used to live in the walls, if it had ever truly been there, evaporated into something colder than indifference. I told myself it was just life. Stress, aging, the inevitable friction that families collect over the years like dust on a forgotten shelf. Family is complicated, I whispered to myself at night, pulling the old quilt tighter around my shoulders. Everyone goes through rough patches. This was normal, but deep down, in the hollow places I didn't like to visit, I knew better. I was becoming a guest in my own home, a tolerated visitor who stayed too long past the welcome. Little things confirmed it. Missing my name. On mail. Conversations that didn't include me, decisions made without my voice in the room. My father's eyes would flick past me like I was an interruption. My mother, once so reliant on me for everything, now moved around me like I was a piece of inconvenient furniture. Still, I stayed. Because leaving meant admitting something was broken. And some part of me, the tired, loyal part, still clung to the hope that if I just kept showing up, if I just kept being good, the ice might hold a little longer. The morning air was sharp, biting through the thin walls of the house like knives. The kind of cold that wraps itself around your bones, leaving no place untouched. I stood at the bottom of the stairs, still clinging to a threadbare hope that this day, Christmas of all days, might soften something in them, might thaw whatever had frozen so solid between us. The living room looked almost festive at first glance. The tree blinked lazily in the corner, its ornaments swaying slightly in the draft from the old vent. A scattering of wrapped gifts lay neatly arranged beneath it, gifts that already felt like props in a play where I no longer had a role. The fireplace was empty, cold ash settling at the bottom. My father was standing by the window, hands shoved deep into the pockets of his slacks. He didn't turn when I entered. My mother sat stiffly on the edge of the sofa, her fingers tangled in the hem of her sweater, picking at an invisible thread. Then, without ceremony, my father spoke. His voice was clipped, low, each word placed with surgical precision. It's time for you to leave, Emily. There was no rise, no fall, no anger, just a flat pronouncement, as if he were commenting on the weather. I blinked, not understanding, not wanting to understand. Leave? The word stumbled out of me, stupid and small. He finally turned, and his eyes, once the color of a summer sky, had hardened into something colder, flatter. He nodded toward the doorway. My gaze followed his, and there it was, my old red suitcase, zipped and ready, propped neatly against the wall. It took me a moment to realize what I was seeing, another to understand what it meant. They had packed it for me. Not a frantic last-minute decision, not a heated argument, a plan. A quiet, deliberate plan. My mother wouldn't look at me. Her gaze stayed fixed on a spot just beyond my shoulder, as if by refusing to meet my eyes she could pretend this wasn't happening. I wanted to ask why. I wanted to demand an explanation, to pull apart the neat lies. They were wrapping this betrayal in. But the words caught somewhere deep in my chest, strangled by a lifetime of swallowing what I wasn't allowed to say. There would be no fight. No scene, no desperate pleas. They had made their choice long before this moment. I crossed the room slowly, the hem of my jeans brushing against the worn rug. The suitcase handle was cold in my hand, as final as a closing door. Outside, the sky was a dull pewter gray, and the frost clinging to the windows blurred the world into shapeless white. Behind me, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the faint hum of the heater trying and failing to warm a house that had long since gone cold. I stepped out into the winter air, the suitcase wheels rattling uselessly against the cracked steps. And as the door clicked shut behind me, I understood. Some endings don't come with a scream or a crash. Some endings are as quiet and as devastating as the falling of snow. The basement apartment smelled faintly of mildew and loneliness. It was small. One narrow window near the ceiling, cracked linoleum floors, a radiator that clanked to life with an angry hiss in the middle of the night. But it was mine. The first few weeks blurred together in a haze of exhaustion. I worked 2 jobs, one at a diner, and another cleaning offices after hours. I scrubbed floors, wiped down tables, smiled until my cheeks hurt. Every dollar counted. Every meal was rationed, every choice weighed. Sometimes, after a double shift, I would collapse onto the sagging mattress wedged into the corner of the room and just lie there, staring at the water stains creeping across the ceiling like slow, inevitable vines. Sleep didn't come easily. The nights were loud, pipes rattling, neighbors arguing through thin walls, the constant hum of the city vibrating up through the floor. I kept very little from the life I had left behind. A battered photo album, corners fraying, tucked safely into a drawer beside my bed. Inside were moments frozen in time, birthday parties, vacations, Christmas mornings before the coldness set in. Faces smiling, arms around shoulders, promises captured in glossy paper that never quite lived up to their image. And then there was the box, a simple, worn cardboard thing, heavy with paperwork. Bills mostly. Mortgage statements, utility accounts, old bank letters. I had handled all of it for years, back when my parents were too busy or too tired or simply didn't want to bother. It had been my job to make sure the lights stayed on, the water ran, the roof stayed over our heads. At first, I didn't know why I brought the box with me. Maybe it was habit. Maybe it was stubbornness, a refusal to leave every piece of my life behind. Or maybe, deep down, I understood that something inside it still connected me to them, even if they had cut me loose without a second thought. I stacked it carefully in the corner, next to the crooked nightstand that wobbled if you touched it. It sat there, gathering dust, a quiet reminder of all the invisible work I had done, all the weight I had carried without thanks or acknowledgement. The photo album was different. Some nights, when the loneliness bit too sharply, I would pull it out and trace the edges of the pictures with my fingertips. I would let myself remember, just for a moment, what it had felt like to believe I was loved without conditions. But when the memories became too heavy, when they pressed against my ribs like stones, I would close the album, slide it back into its hiding place and turn toward the future, thin, uncertain, but finally my own. 6 months slipped by, each day folding quietly into the next. Life didn't get easier, but it became familiar. The rhythm of early mornings, long shifts, short nights. I kept my head down, my world small. Then the emails started. At first, I thought they were just leftover noise. Automated reminders, subscription notices from a life I had already shed. I would swipe them away without reading. But one afternoon, hunched over a lukewarm cup of diner coffee during a rare break, I opened one by accident. Final notice. Electric bill overdue. Service scheduled for disconnection. I stared at the screen, heart thudding dully in my chest. The account was in my name, an old arrangement, a convenience I had handled without question. I remembered setting up the automatic payments, making sure due dates never slipped, smoothing out the small frictions of living that my parents hadn't wanted to bother with. A week later, another email. Water bill, past due. Then another, mortgage delinquency warning. It hit me slowly, like realizing a slow leak has flooded the basement. My father hadn't thought to take over any of it. He hadn't transferred the bills, hadn't even changed the contact information. In his rush to erase me from their lives, he had forgotten just how much of it had been stitched together with my quiet, unseen labor. I could have stepped in, could have sent a message, a reminder, a warning. It would have taken 5 minutes to fix. But sitting there in the dim, grease-slicked booth, I felt a stillness settle over me, cold and clean. I didn't owe them anything anymore. So I didn't reply. I didn't forward the notices. I didn't call the companies. I simply watched, silently, as the fabric of their perfect, curated life began to fray. Every forgotten payment, every missed deadline, was a thread pulled loose from the tapestry they had valued more than me. And I sat back, hands folded neatly, in my lap, and let the unraveling begin. It wasn't rage that kept me silent. It was something colder, something heavier. Justice, maybe. Or the simple, brutal symmetry of consequences meeting actions. The house that had once shut me out was starting to crumble from the inside, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel powerless. It was a late afternoon when I found myself back on the old road, tires humming against the cracked asphalt, familiar trees leaning in over the curves like old sentries. I hadn't meant to drive past the house. I told myself it was just habit, muscle memory guiding me when my mind drifted. But maybe some part of me needed to see it, needed proof that the silence I had chosen was doing its slow, inevitable work. The house came into view around the bend, and I slowed, heart thudding a slow, steady beat. It looked smaller somehow, sagging at the edges. The white paint, once crisp and clean, had dulled to a tired gray, flecked with patches where the wood underneath peeked through like old scars. The lawn, once my mother's pride, was overgrown, wild with tall grass that bent and whispered in the breeze. Dandelions and weeds claimed every bare patch, defiant and free. The hedges along the walkway, once trimmed into perfect boxes, sprawled outward in unruly tangles. And there, slapped across the front door, was a bright red notice. The paper flapped slightly in the wind, held on by a single strip of duct tape. From the car, I could just make out the words, "Final notice." I pulled over, engine ticking softly in the sudden quiet. The house sat there, lifeless, under a sky heavy with bruised clouds. A single gutter had come loose, swinging gently in the breeze, knocking a hollow rhythm against the siding. I didn't get out of the car. I didn't need to. Every crack in the foundation, every broken shingle, every unpaid bill was a language I understood fluently. They had built a life on a foundation of silence and expectation, and without someone to quietly patch the leaks and oil the hinges, it was falling apart, piece by quiet piece. There was no satisfaction in it, no triumph. Just a deep, resonant sense of balance, like watching a story finish exactly the way it was always meant to. I thought about the nights I had stayed up late sorting through bills, calling companies, fixing mistakes no one else had noticed. The small, invisible threads I had used to keep this house, their house, from unraveling. Now, without my hands holding it all together, the tapestry was shredding in slow motion. For a moment, I wondered if they regretted it. If they lay, awake at night listening to the house groan and settle around them, feeling the slow rot they had unleashed. But then I let the thought drift away, like smoke from a dying fire. Their regret was never my responsibility. I shifted the car into drive, easing away from the curb without looking back. Some things, once broken, are not meant to be rebuilt. It was at the farmer's market, of all places, that the truth finally found me. I was standing by a stall of late summer peaches, breathing in the sticky sweet scent, when I heard a voice call my name. I turned to see Mrs. Aldridge, our old next-door neighbor, waving at me with the same warm smile she'd always had, a little slower now with age, but just as kind. We made small talk at first. The weather, her new grandchild, the way the town had changed. It felt almost normal, like I could pretend for a moment that everything hadn't been torn apart. Then she hesitated, fingers fiddling with the strap of her purse, a shadow flickering across her face. I was so sorry to hear about what happened. Emily, she said, voice lowering. It wasn't right the way they went about it. I frowned, unsure what she meant. She saw the confusion in my eyes and sighed, glancing around as if to make sure no one else was listening. I probably shouldn't say anything, she said. But your parents. They were talking about selling the house for a long time. Even before Christmas. It wasn't a spur-of-the-moment thing. The words hit harder than I expected, knocking the breath from my lungs. They told a few of us at Bridge Club, she continued quietly. Said they needed the money. Said you were holding them back. I stood there, the noise of the market dulling around me, the bright tents and laughter blurring into meaningless color. They called you. Dead weight, she added gently, almost apologetically. Said you were too attached to the house, to the past, that it was time for them to move on. I nodded, though I could barely feel my hands anymore. I thanked her for telling me. I even managed a smile, brittle and tight, before walking away with my empty canvas bag swinging at my side. Dead weight. It hadn't been anger that drove them to push me out. It hadn't even been disappointment. It had been calculation, cold and methodical, like cleaning out a closet, discarding what no longer served them. I thought back to the packed suitcase by the door that morning, how neatly everything had been folded, how final it had all felt. They hadn't stumbled into betrayal. They had prepared for it. They had decided I was disposable, an obstacle to the life they wanted. As I walked back to my car, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows, across the asphalt something inside me shifted, not with rage, not with grief, but with a deep, steady acceptance. Some truths are heavy, but once you carry them long enough, they stop feeling like burdens. They become armor. I sat at the small kitchen table in my apartment, a scattering of papers, spread out before me like a map of old, forgotten roads. Bank accounts, utility bills, insurance policies, tiny pieces of my former life that had clung stubbornly to me like burrs on a hiking trail. One by one, I severed them. A few clicks, a few signatures. It was almost too easy, the way entire histories could be dissolved with the stroke of a pen. I removed my name from the mortgage, from the energy account, from the water company's records. Each confirmation email felt like a door closing gently behind me, a final punctuation mark on sentences that no longer needed to be spoken. At the center of the table sat a single battered object, the old house key. I turned it over in my hand, the metal warm from my touch, its edges dulled from years of use. Once, it had been a symbol of belonging. Now it was nothing more than a shard of a life I no longer lived. I picked up a pair of pliers, hesitating for only a moment, and snapped it clean in two. The sound was sharp in the stillness, louder than I expected, like a tiny crack splitting. Across a frozen lake, I slid the broken halves into a plain white envelope, sealed it carefully, and wrote their address in slow, deliberate letters across the front. No note, no explanation. They would know exactly what it meant. Sometimes, I thought, The deepest love doesn't die in anger or betrayal. It dies quietly, in small moments of realization, in the long spaces between phone calls that never come, in the way a name once spoken with warmth becomes just another word. The kind of death you don't mourn with tears or graves or flowers. The kind you mourn by waking up one morning and realizing you no longer check your phone hoping for their call. You no longer look for their faces in a crowd. You simply let them go. I placed the envelope at the bottom of the outgoing mail bin downstairs, tucked between junk flyers and a glossy grocery store circular. No ceremony, no witnesses, just a clean break, a final, silent goodbye. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday evening, the kind where the sky slips into darkness before you even realize the day is over. I had run into the store for something simple, bread maybe, or coffee, the kind of errand you don't think twice about. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as I wandered down the aisles, lost in my own quiet thoughts, when I caught a glimpse of someone at the end of the row. A hunched figure, gray coat too big for his frame, shoulders bowed not just with age but with something heavier. My steps slowed without thinking. The man turned, and for a moment the world went very still. It was my father. I hadn't seen him since that morning, the morning they pushed me out and closed the door behind me. But time had done its work. His hair was thinner now, what was left of it washed out into a dull silver. His face, once stern and unreadable, sagged with deep lines, the kind carved by regret more than years. Even his posture, the proud square of his shoulders, had collapsed inward, as if he were trying to take up less space in a world that no longer bent for him. Our eyes met across the shelves. His hand faltered halfway to a can of soup. For one breathless second, I thought he might speak, that he might call out, apologize, try to bridge the chasm he had dug between us with his own hands. But he didn't, and neither did I. I held his gaze, steady, unflinching, and then, without a word, turned and walked away. The soles of my boots struck the tile floor with quiet, measured steps. I didn't look back. There was a time when I would have needed something from him. An apology, an explanation, even just an acknowledgement of what he had done. But standing there in that aisle, watching him shrink into the fluorescent shadows, I understood something simple and unshakable. I didn't need anything from him anymore. Some confrontations don't need words. Some victories don't come with fireworks or declarations. Sometimes the greatest power lies in the choice to leave someone standing there with all their empty apologies unspoken, all their regrets left to rot in the silence they created. I stepped into the night air, cool and clean against my skin, and breathed deeply. It tasted like freedom. It was a few weeks later when the news found me. I was sipping coffee at the small diner near my apartment, the kind of place with cracked vinyl booths and a jukebox that hadn't worked in years. An old family friend, Mr. Hanley, a man who had known my parents since before I was born, slid into the seat across from me. His face was lined with quiet sympathy. He didn't dance around it. "They lost the house," he said simply. The words settled between us, heavy but not surprising. I wrapped my hands around my mug, feeling the faint tremble of the ceramic against my palms. Foreclosure went through last month. Bank took it. They're renting now, a small apartment on the east side. I pictured it, not with satisfaction, but with a detached, almost clinical curiosity. Tiny rooms, peeling walls, the smell of other lives lingering in the air. A far cry from the pristine image they had curated for so long. The big house, the manicured lawn, the perfect family portrait that had cracked quietly behind the scenes. Mr. Hanley went on, telling me things I hadn't asked to know. How my father looked thinner these days. How my mother's health had declined again, stress eating away at her strength. How they had disappeared from the neighborhood gatherings they once ruled. I listened, nodding when it felt appropriate, offering soft murmurs of understanding. But inside, there was only a stillness, a deep, unwavering calm. Their downfall wasn't something I had orchestrated. It was something they had built, brick by brick, with every cold glance, every selfish decision, every betrayal wrapped in silence. I had simply stopped holding the walls up for them. There was no gloating in me, no dark thrill, only a bittersweet sort of acceptance. The kind you feel when a long, painful story finally reaches its inevitable ending. People think revenge needs to be loud, slamming doors, shouted accusations, courtroom showdowns. But real justice, the kind that seeps into your bones, is often quiet. It's the silence left in the wake of someone's choices crashing down around them. It's living your life without carrying their weight anymore. As Mr. Hanley spoke, I stirred my coffee absent-mindedly, watching the cream spiral into the dark until it disappeared completely. Some things dissolve that way, slowly, completely, and without a sound. 1 year later, Christmas found me again. This time, it was in a tiny apartment tucked above a bookstore downtown. The ceilings were low, the radiator still clanked like a grumpy old man, and the windows let in more cold than light. But it was mine. I stood in the corner of the living room, unraveling a cheap string of colored lights I had picked up from a clearance bin. The bulbs flickered uncertainly, some brighter than others, casting soft pools of blue, red, and green against the peeling paint. The tree was small enough to fit on a side table, a scrappy little thing with crooked branches, and the scent of fresh pine clinging stubbornly to its needles. I set it upright, adjusting it until it leaned just right, and draped the lights around it, laughing quietly when the entire tree wobbled under the weight. In a paper bag at my feet sat a single ornament I had chosen carefully, deliberately. A small glass bird, wings outstretched mid-flight, captured in perfect, fragile motion. I lifted it from its wrapping, feeling the cool smoothness of it in my palm. With careful fingers, I hung it near the top of the tree, where it could catch the light. It spun gently in the draft from the window, shimmering with each turn, delicate, but defiant. I stepped back, taking it all in, the humble tree, the mismatched lights, the quiet peace that filled the room like a warm breath. There was no pile of gifts, no family gathering, no grand celebration, just me. Whole, standing in the wreckage and rebuilding something new from it. Sometimes I realized losing everything doesn't leave you empty. Sometimes it clears enough space to find yourself again, lighter, freer, ready to take flight.